This video is part of a series where I intend to gather some wild clay, make a pot, fire it to earthenware in a wood fire, then use it as a cooking vessel to prepare a meal, again in a wood fire. There were only supposed to be 4 videos in this series when I started, but along the way I had failures in firing. I also explored an interesting but unproductive sidetrack, and now I've made some more large pots. In this episode I'm going to fire them. Just to recap the changes that I hope will make a difference to the firing this time. I've made 5 pots, each using a different blend of clay, or clay plus sand and or grog, made from ground up pieces of the pots that failed in the last firing. Most of these pots have thinner walls, except for this one which has both sand and grog mixed in, and it was really difficult to handle. Interestingly, now it's dry, it feels really solid, so maybe it'll be okay. For firing, I'm going to dig a deeper pit this time, but not a full-blown kiln for reasons I've explained in the previous episode. I'm going to light a bigger fire and keep it hotter for longer, and when it burns down, I'm going to cover it up to try to allow the pots to cool down evenly. So that's the plan, and before we head off for firing, I'll just show you what's changed since the previous episode. I haven't done anything to the egg-shaped pot or this other one, just going to fire these exactly as they are. I tidied up this crinkle-crankle pot using a rough pebble to smooth out some of the bumps, but it's still pretty rough and I'm not going to try burnishing it or anything. I added a bit more of a lip on the last pot that I made while the clay was still moist. I just felt like it needed this to complement the rounded shape. And I decided it might be interesting to try decorating this pot. Ideally, I'd like to paint it with earth pigments. Now, if I planned this better, I could have kept some of the iron ore that I used for my 100k iron play button. But that was a long time ago, and I don't have that stuff anymore. Or I could have collected some of the bright red soil I saw around various parts of Dorset and Somerset during my recent visit there. Responsible collection, of course, from tractor clods on the road or something like that. But I didn't do that either. So, as is often the case, another plan is required. I took a little walk along Porchester Shore, thinking I might find a chunk of iron ore washed out of the ground near the top of the foreshore. There is iron ore present like that all along the Solent coast, and I've found it before in this sort of location. I saw a lot of red rocks, but mostly these are just flints that have been turned red on their surface by beach fires. Iron is the reason for these turning red, but I can't use this as pigment. It's too hard to grind up, and the red is typically only on the surface of the rock. I did find one little piece of what might be iron ore, but when I broke it, I think it's possible it's just a piece of the local clay that's been accidentally fired hard by a beach fire. It doesn't feel like a worn piece of brick. There is some interesting clay here, by the way. Looks a little bit different to the wild clay I have back at home, but I probably shouldn't dig it from here. I suppose I could probably ask for a bucket of subsoil from this building site here, where they're building some new houses in this low-lying piece of land, right next to an estuary that regularly floods. What could possibly go wrong with that idea? It's impossible to predict. Anyway, no iron ore to speak of, but all is not lost. The industrial and marine history of Porchester has unfortunately involved quite a lot of dumping of stuff in the sea, including a load of nuts and bolts and offcuts of scrap metal. There used to be an engineering company here, and I expect this is some of their scrap from decades ago, dumped here, rusting on the beach. Rust is basically iron ore with extra steps, so I collected a small bag of the most rusty bolts and stuff that I could find. Back at home I gave these a quick rinse just to remove grit and sand, then drained them and set about breaking away some of the rusty concretion on the pieces. In fact, some of them were nothing but rust, and they crumbled away entirely into pieces when I bashed them. Others still had something metallic left in the middle, so I set the metal aside. I'll take it for recycling next time I go to the tip. The pieces that came off look pretty dark, and they're soaking wet, which will make it hard to grind them down to dust, so I put them in an old pan and toasted them over my little camp stove. Like I've said before, everything eventually turns into a cooking video on this channel. As they dried out, they turned a bit redder, and I left them to cool. Once cool, I smashed them up in a cardboard tube on top of an old piece of steel beam, using a metal bar. I don't have a sieve fine enough to separate the material I want, so I transferred the crushed stuff into a piece of cheesecloth, then picked up the corners and gave it a little shake inside the strainer. Rust dust. Don't breathe this. Once I had enough ground up rust, it's still not really as fine as I'd like, but this will have to do. I mixed a bit of my remaining purified clay together with some water. This clay will hopefully act as a binder for the rust particles as pigment. I mixed in about twice as much rust dust as clay and blended it together as best I could, and there it is. I thought before I go straight at painting a pot, I'd better just test it on the back of my artificial fossil slab, and that seemed to go pretty well, so I started painting my round pot, which did not go so well as the test. This stuff's really blobby and difficult. I did the best I could to paint some sort of swirly patterns on the pot. I tried with a different brush that was a bit stiffer, and that did help. I just sort of made the pattern up as I went along. Really crude, but a lot of that comes down to skill, or lack thereof. Painting is not my forte, but I think what we got here suits the pot, sort of. It's very brown. Maybe we should call that bright brown. But this is iron, so during firing it might turn red or black, or it might stay brown. I don't actually mind what happens next. I hope it will at least create a contrast against the body of the pot, but we'll just have to see. Although I washed this rust before I made the paint, it probably still also contains some salt from having been immersed in the sea, and I understand salt can do interesting things with clay during firing. Salt alone can be used to create a glaze on fired pottery. It acts as a flux, I believe, sodium ions joining up with silica to make a durable glassy surface. So it might help to bond the iron onto the pot, or it might go shiny, or it might make everything run and drip, or the iron paint might just crumble and fall off completely, or it might explode. Exciting times. Now, are you wondering what might happen if we mix this rust dust into the clay before making a pot? Well, I was wondering that, so I decided to stop wondering and try it. With most of the remaining purified clay, I added in some of the rust powder and worked it in. Doesn't seem like it was very much, so I added some more, then some more, maybe about 10% of the volume of the clay in total. Then I started making pinch pots. I made 2 little pinch pots about the same size, fairly thin walls, roughed up and wetted their rims, and then joined them rim to rim, blending and smoothing over the join. Then a whole load more smoothing and blending and scraping and smoothing and blending until we have a nearly spherical pot body. For the moment, without an opening. When it had stood for about half an hour, it felt a lot firmer. I don't think this process is drying so much as it's about the particles in the clay locking together to make it more solid. Like the opposite of how quicksand happens, I suppose. Anyway, I used the point of an old kitchen knife to cut a small circle out of the top of the pot, just big enough for me to get my finger inside, and blend together the seam between the 2 halves by feel. At this point, it's still possible to gently straighten out any dips and bumps by pressing from the inside whilst supporting it from the outside, or vice versa. And running my finger around the inside allowed me to just broaden out the profile of the pot to take it away from the spherical form just a tiny bit. Then, with slightly moistened fingers, I tidied up the lip. There won't be a rim on this, just a straight inward-facing lip. So this is like a tiny version of a Native American seed jar. Maybe I'll even use it for storing seeds. So by the time I'd made this little iron-grogged pot, the other pots were well on their way to being dry. Drying seems to happen slowly at first, then accelerate, which makes sense if you think about it. As the clay dries, the particles shrink, creating a more porous texture. The greater porosity means water can get out more easily. Fortunately, the little pot, because it's little and has a very thin wall, won't take long to catch up. I think it will be dry at the same time, so it's not holding up production. While it's somewhere in the region of leather hard, I'm just going to smooth it with the polished pebble. This isn't quite the same as burnishing, but it will have an effect that's partly similar. The reason I'm not just going to wait until this is dry to burnish it is that there are some fairly gritty particles of rust in this mix. If I smooth it with a stone while the clay is still slightly damp, those particles will have somewhere to go when the stone pushes on them, and they won't just get torn out. And having smoothed out the surface like that when it was damp, it's then easy to burnish later as it dries, again without tearing out a chunk of that gritty rust grog. Meanwhile, the rest of the pots are drying nicely. Once they're about halfway and had done all the shrinking they're likely to do, I moved them to a sunny spot to speed up the remainder of the drying. Here's how much that round pot has shrunk. When it was freshly made, I could easily get my whole hand inside. Now it's dry, I would have to use force to squeeze my hand in there. Not going to do that now in case I break it. The raw, unrefined clay pot was still a bit rough and bumpy on the inside, so I used the rough limestone pebble to smooth it off a bit. Again, this is not burnishing, I'm not aiming for a polished surface, I'm just knocking off the high spots and sharp edges. It looks pretty messy at the end of that, but I think the firing will sort that out. The pots dried pretty thoroughly on the windowsill, but then we had a few days of rain that delayed firing. So like a weird clay-obsessed Columbo, there's just one more little thing playing on my mind. What if we mix a lot of the iron powder into the clay? Well, I had a little handful of purified clay left over, so I mixed it together with about the same volume of rust powder and granules. One more little side quest. I know I said I wouldn't, but here we are. Didn't get any footage of that because, like I say, rain. The camera setup is less waterproof than I am. The result was, as you might expect, quite coarse and difficult to work, so I just made this crude little humanoid figure from a single piece where the extremities are pinched away out from the piece rather than joined on. I'll show you what I mean by that with this other piece of clay recorded on a different day indoors since it was still pouring with rain. Instead of trying to join on the arms and legs and head onto the torso, I just sort of turn a lump of clay into a starfish shape, then keep reshaping the extremities until they look a bit like arms and legs and head. For a heavily grogged clay with low plasticity like this, keeping it all in one piece seems like it should work better than trying to join separate pieces together. Now there's copious iron already in this clay, and I just added a load more. Might be more than 50% iron oxide in total. On that assumption, I think I shall call this thing mostly Iron Oxide Man. On a side note, I think the first ceramic items made by humans were probably not pots or vessels, and this seems to be supported by archaeological evidence. After all, why would you make a pot out of clay and put it in a fire unless you already knew what happens to clay in a fire? Unless you already had an expectation that the fire would transform it into a durable item. I think the first ceramic items made by humans were probably little mud figures of people or animals, like mostly Iron Oxide Man, or like this little clay animal I'm about to make here. Maybe created as gifts or playthings for children, maybe with some purpose related to planning a hunt or something, maybe created for some sort of ritual purpose, although that often seems to me the equivalent of "we don't know" in archaeology. Maybe simply expressive art. Or maybe created for all of the above purposes rolled into the form of stories and legends told around a fire, illustrated with little clay figures, sort of portable cave paintings if you like. Whatever the reason for making them, they are incredibly easy to make in their most simple form. At some point, the figures end up in the fire. Perhaps the narrative of some story or legend needed a dramatic finish. Perhaps the children put the figures in the fire. Or perhaps the ritual required the symbolic items to be given to the fire. Or perhaps something as simple as the pieces being left by the fire to dry out after the stories are told and getting accidentally knocked into the embers. Then someone notices the next day that the figures are not only intact in the ashes, but now they're stronger and more durable. Now you have the observation that mud plus fire makes resilient material that retains its original shape, whatever shape you choose. And there is the trigger to imagine what else might be done with it. Museums are full of these little clay figures, and I think people probably made these before they made pots. So that's how it might all have started, and I believe it's true that clay figures and ornaments appear earlier in the archaeological record than any evidence of actual pottery. However, pottery likely started more than once in different places independently, so maybe everyone who has a hypothesis is right, or maybe nobody is. Anyway, enough of that. It's stopped raining now. Off to fire these pots. Early on a bright and sunny November morning, following several days of heavy rain, and with at least a week more of heavy rain forecast starting tomorrow, this is my window of opportunity for getting these pots fired. So off to the orchard, and this time I'm digging a deeper and more elongated fire pit. The soil is really damp, but fortunately it's very free-draining sand, so it's quite easy to dig, but it will need some drying out with the primary fire. I heaped up the earth I dug around the edge of the pit to create a bit of a windbreak, because I think cold wind blowing on the exposed parts of the pots last time was why they cracked. I built the primary fire in the pit and got that going. The purpose of this fire is to warm the pit, dry out the soil, and also give me a chance to warm the pots too. So like last time, I made a little raft of small logs on the edge of the fire and set up the pots there, turning them every now and again to try to warm them. The logs keep the pots off the damp soil. This will also hopefully drive off any lingering moisture inside the clay, although I don't really think we have a problem with that. Once the primary fire had died down completely, I levelled out the bed of embers and laid a layer of thickish logs above them. Then I arranged the pots on these. Ideally, they should have been warmed by the fireside to the point of being too hot to touch, but they were not quite there. But this is part of the reason for putting them over the bed of embers now. They will warm up quite a lot, hopefully fairly evenly, in the oven-like environment of the warmed pit, while I carefully build the secondary fire over and around them. It took about 15 or 20 minutes for the secondary fire to catch, so I'm fairly happy that the pots will have been nicely warmed through by the time the fire really got going. As it burned, and boy did it burn, I added more wood. Maybe I went a bit overboard with this in all honesty, but I wanted a really nice hot fire throughout the entire pit. That burned for about 45 minutes, and as it began to die down, I added some thicker pieces of wood around the edge. This isn't so much to add heat as to create some more embers to make sure everything stays covered up and out of the wind. Another 45 minutes or so, and everything was burning down to quite small embers. I noticed that some of the lumps of earth around the edge of the pit have taken on that characteristic red colour of fired clay, so I think there probably is a little bit of clay in this soil, but it's mixed with a lot of sand. See how easily those clumps just crumble apart. Time for a little snack. a couple of nice ripe apples on a hazel stick, suspended over the fire to roast. I also found some field mushrooms at the orchard, so I picked a couple of those and put them on another stick to cook over the fire. The apples cooked in a couple of minutes and began to bubble and caramelise. After just a little time cooling, I gave them a taste. Really nice. The heatwave we had this summer has made the apples quite small but very sweet. The mushrooms, not so nice. They were cooked and the flavour was good, but some ash must have blown into the gills and they were unpleasantly gritty. Oh well, can't win them all. After about another 30 minutes, I could start to see parts of the pots protruding from the ashes, and when I raked the embers to cover them, I was just exposing something else. Faced with a choice here, either leave them in the fire partly uncovered and possibly cooling unevenly, or start pulling them out. They will cool a lot faster if they're pulled out, but they will cool more evenly all over. So I made an executive decision. I chose option 2. Over the next 10 minutes, I pulled the various pots out and put them on a raft of logs near the fire to cool down as slowly as possible. Everything has survived in one piece, but I can already see a small crack in the rim of the big round pot. I don't think that's a crack from cooling. I think it's probably just from some grit or impurity in the wild clay or a fault in the construction. They took about half an hour to cool to the point where I could handle them. Time for a cup of coffee, made in a tin mug over some spare embers. The hazel leaf keeps the ash out of the cup. At this point, I was really happy to see that there are at least a couple of completely intact pots that we can take on to the next stage, which will be cooking a meal in them. All of them sound like they've fired properly, although some of them ring more sweetly than others. The ones that don't ring so well might be cracked somewhere. Regardless, I feel that thinner walls, hotter fire and more even though quite rapid cooling, are indeed the success factors that I hoped they would be. One item I'm really surprised survived more or less intact is the artificial fossil slab. I really expected this one to just blow up. It does have some big cracks in it, but it held together in one piece. Let's open it up and have a look inside. It opened very easily with just a little twist of my knife in the edge, and yep, this is pretty much what I hoped for and expected. The leaf is now just a crumbly wafer of carbon, but it's left a clear imprint in the clay, as well as a sort of halo where the materials of the leaf must have boiled out and escaped. Nice. Once the pots were fully cooled, I packed them up and took them home to brush off the ash. Let's take a proper look at them. The round pot. This was made from unrefined wild clay, plus potsherd grog. It fired mostly okay, except for one tiny crack in the rim. I won't try to cook in this one, but it's close enough to intact that I will probably keep it. The iron oxide paint on the outside has sort of worked. It's a bit crumbly in places where it was thickest, but it has stayed on mostly, although it's not really all that visible against the carbonised clay. I decided the next day, when the forecasted rain started, to leave this pot out in the garden and let it wash off in the rain, and we'll see what happens there. The egg-shaped pot. This one was made from purified clay, no grog added, and it's the most successful firing. It rings like a bell. It feels really solid and well fired. There are a couple of places where it has a metallic sheen, probably as the fire smothered itself and created a reducing environment. I think this is the one I will cook in. This sort of standard-looking pot was made from unrefined wild clay, nothing added, and only the big bits of grit taken out. It's fired well, it feels solid, nice and smooth on the inside, and it rings, maybe not quite as nicely as the previous one. Not sure if that's just because of the shape or the material, or if it indicates an invisible crack somewhere. So possibly another contender for cooking here. This squat pot has been quite the victorious underdog. This was made with the double-grogged clay that had both sand plus ground potsherds. The clay was incredibly difficult to work, and so the pot is rather crude-looking, but it's fired very nicely with no cracks. I suppose with that much grog in there, that's maybe not such a surprise, except it is to me because this pot never really felt like it was even holding together while I was making it. Now that it's fired, it rings really nicely, and I think it would stand to be used for cooking. The crinkle crankle wingle wangle pot made from sand-tempered purified clay has got a couple of cracks in the rim, which is unsurprising. In fact, I expected this to fare worse than it actually did. Still, it's not very useful though, and there's almost no trace at all of the leaf that I pressed into the inside. But that's okay because the leaf gave me the idea for the artificial fossil, which was very interesting. The mini seed jar was made from purified clay with about 10% rust powder. This thing is truly beautiful. The burnished surface has undergone reduction and is metallic looking across almost its entire surface, and in a couple of places there are some little shimmery rainbow patches that I can see the camera isn't doing full justice to. Again, nicely fired, and this pot is a little treasure. I feel totally vindicated in pursuing those side quests now. Mostly iron oxide man, made from purified clay grogged with 50% or more of rust powder, fired completely intact and feels really nice and solid and heavy. Again, reduction in the firing has given some of the iron flecks a silvery metallic shine. Neolithic animal friend, this one was really an afterthought, made from shell-grogged purified clay, and despite being fired for maybe only 20 minutes in the primary fire, has come out looking, of all of the pieces, the most like normal fired earthenware, with terracotta and brick red colours. This is something to think about. Now, I know this is a very small piece, but I think it's worth considering if the other larger pieces might actually have been fully fired after quite a short time. Maybe I've actually overfired all of these pots. Certainly I think if we'd pulled them earlier and not left them buried, we'd be looking at more reds and browns instead of black and silver. Maybe I'll try another experiment in future with a thin-walled pot in a fire that burns nice and hot, then pull it off to cool after maybe 30 or 40 minutes instead of leaving it in the embers for an hour or two. Anyway, we do now have usable pots, so the next episode can finally happen, which will be cooking a meal in a wild clay pot over a wood fire. I do find myself wondering what all this carbon blackening and reduced iron is going to do when we try that, and I think these pots will probably need a dummy run with something that's not quite food just to help clean them out, but we'll soon see in the next episode. I hope this has been interesting. Thanks for watching and joining me on the journey so far, and I hope to see you again soon.